The storm came with a fury, howling across the plains with no mercy. But within the walls of the hidden snow room, the cold never reached. Here, the wisdom of ancestors had been etched into the very structure of the land itself, ensuring warmth and safety, when the world outside was swallowed whole by snow. Before we step into the heart of this winter's legend, share where you are watching from. And if the resilience of the old tribes calls to you, subscribe. Tomorrow's tale is as ancient as the winds that howl through these hills. The cold wind whispered across the endless plains, carrying with it the promise of a fierce storm. Echo stood at the entrance of his lodge, his senses sharp as the bitter wind cut through the air. The skies were a dull gray, heavy with the weight of a storm that had not yet arrived but was already felt in the very air. In the distance, the sound of howling wolves carried on the wind, their cries echoing like a warning. It was the kind of cold that could freeze a man's breath in mid-air, and the kind of storm that had been foreseen by the elders in the village. Echo had spent his life learning to read the signs, to understand what the land and the sky were telling him. And now, in the dead of winter, he felt the storm's grip tightening. It would be no ordinary storm. He glanced back into the warmth of the lodge, where his wife, Ahuli, and their 2 children were preparing for the coming nights. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light dancing across the walls of the lodge, but Echo knew that fire alone would not be enough to survive the storm. He had seen winters like this before, winters where the snow buried the plains, and the wind howled so loud that it seemed the world itself might be torn apart. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. When the storm comes, it will not be enough to build a shelter. You must build a refuge, something that the cold cannot touch. Echo knew the storm was coming, and it would test everything he had learned. But he was not afraid. The wisdom of his people had been passed down through the generations, and they had endured storms like this before. They had built homes that could withstand even the harshest winters, homes that would keep them safe when the world outside was swallowed by snow and ice. As Echo walked to the edge of the lodge, the wind intensified, biting into his skin, reminding him of the urgency of the moment. He had no time to waste. He had to prepare, not just for his family, but for the entire tribe. The snow room, the refuge his ancestors had built for such storms, had to be ready. Echo had spent many days preparing for this winter, gathering the thick furs and animal hides that would line the walls of the hidden chamber. It was a place that had been used for generations, hidden deep within the earth or nestled in the back of the lodge. It was a room that would not just keep the cold at bay, it would trap the warmth inside and protect them from the fury of the storm. He knelt at the entrance of the snow room, touching the fur-lined door with reverence. His people had long understood how to build not just shelter, but survival. And now, in the face of a storm unlike any other, it was time for that knowledge to be put to the test. Echo's hands moved with purpose as he carefully closed the fur-lined door to the snow room. Inside, his family gathered, readying themselves for the storm's wrath. The walls of the hidden room were lined with thick hides, fur, and layers of earth, ensuring that no breath of wind could penetrate. The fire in the main lodge would not be enough once the storm fully arrived, but this sanctuary would offer them warmth, protection, and survival. The snow room had been designed long before Echo's time, a gift of knowledge passed down through generations. It was not merely a space to sleep or rest, but a sacred refuge, a place where the tribe's ancestors had weathered the most ferocious of storms. Echo's grandfather had told him countless stories of the hidden shelters, rooms within rooms, built in secret, designed to withstand the fiercest winters the land could offer. This knowledge had been lost to many, forgotten by those who chose to build quickly and carelessly. But not Echo. He had listened, he had learned, and now he was ready to carry the legacy forward. The storm had already begun to rage outside, but Echo knew that this room, this sacred space, would keep them safe. The cold would not touch them here. He had done what was necessary. Each layer of fur, each plank of wood, each stone placed in the walls had been laid with intent, designed to trap the warmth of the fire and hold it there, creating an environment where life could continue even as the world outside froze. Ahuli moved to his side, her face bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. She had been his partner in this endeavor, her hands just as skilled as his in preparing the shelter. She placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a quiet but knowing glance. She too understood the importance of this space. It was not just for their family. It was for the survival of the entire tribe. Echo could feel the storm growing stronger, the winds howling like wild animals outside. He could see the snow swirling through the cracks in the lodge walls, but inside the snow room it was warm and still. The fire crackled, its flames dancing in the small stone hearth. The glow of the fire lit the walls, casting shadows on the floor, and for the first time since the storm began, Echo felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. They were safe, for now. As he sat down beside his family, Echo felt a deep connection to the land. This room, this refuge, was a symbol of everything his people had endured. It was a reminder that survival was not about strength alone, but about wisdom and understanding. His ancestors had known the land, had worked with it, not against it. And now, as the storm raged outside, Echo knew that they would continue to live because they had learned to live with the land, not conquer it. The storm would test them, yes. But Echo was not afraid. They were not just surviving, they were thriving, wrapped in the warmth of their ancestors' knowledge, sheltered by the land that had cared for them since time immemorial. The storm howled through the night, its winds like the roar of a great beast. But inside the snow room, Echo and his family sat in peace. The warmth from the fire filled the air, and the crackle of burning wood was a comforting sound against the fury outside. Yet Echo knew that peace would not last. The storm was but the beginning of a long, cold winter, and more than shelter was needed to survive. Echo rose from his place beside Ahuli, his heart heavy with the weight of his ancestors' teachings. He had learned much, but he knew that the land itself held the true power. It was not enough to simply build a structure to survive. They had to honor the spirits of the earth, the sky, and the animals. These forces had always protected the tribe, but only if the people remembered to give thanks and ask for their guidance. It was early in the morning when Echo stepped outside the snow room and into the storm. The wind bit at his skin, but he moved with purpose, his breath steady. He did not fear the cold. The cold had always been a part of him, just as the warmth of the earth was. He walked toward the forest, his footsteps silent in the thick snow. Every step was a prayer. He knew that the trees, the stones, and the animals had spirits that could help him in this time of need. But first he had to listen. The forest stood still, the trees bending in the wind, as though whispering to each other. Echo closed his eyes, extending his senses. He reached deep within, remembering the stories his grandfather had told him, the stories of the spirits who lived in every tree, every rock, and every gust of wind. He knew that he was not alone. With reverence, he placed his hand on a great oak tree, its bark cold and rough under his touch. "I seek your strength," he whispered. The wind shifted, and the snow around him seemed to calm for a moment, as if the tree had heard him. He stepped back and continued his walk, searching for the materials he would need for the next phase of his preparations. Echo gathered branches from the trees, as well as stones that would be used to reinforce the snow room's foundation. He knew that every piece he collected held a part of the earth's spirit. The stones would hold the warmth, the branches would offer protection, and the earth itself would hold the family steady through the storm. As he worked, Echo felt the presence of the spirits around him. The spirits of the ancestors, guiding, protecting, and sharing their knowledge. He was reminded of the sacredness of the land and the importance of giving thanks. This was not just about survival, it was about living in harmony with the world around him. The land had provided everything they needed, and it would continue to do so as long as they gave it the respect it deserved. Echo returned to the snow room with his offerings, his heart full of gratitude. He placed the branches and stones in their proper places, knowing that they would help keep the warmth in and the cold out. The fire in the hearth flickered, casting a soft glow on the walls. He knew the worst of the storm was yet to come, but with the spirits by his side, he felt a deep sense of peace. They were ready. Echo's breath was steady, his body moving with practiced precision as he worked to finish the snow room. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but inside the hidden shelter, warmth and calm reigned. The room, constructed with layers of fur, hides, and earth, was becoming a sanctuary. Each layer added a sense of sacredness to the space, a space that would protect not just their bodies, but their spirits as well. Echo's wife, Ahuli, worked beside him, her hand steady as she placed more fur along the walls. Her strength was a silent presence beside him, and together they worked in unison. Their children huddled by the hearth, their faces glowing from the firelight, their eyes wide with wonder at the room that had come to life. It was more than just walls and warmth. It was their connection to the past, to the land, and to the spirits who had watched over their people for countless generations. The fire crackled in the small stone hearth, its warmth spreading throughout the snow room. The dance of the flames illuminated the fur-lined walls, casting shadows that seemed to move like the spirits of their ancestors. Echo felt their presence here, in this sacred space. He closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer of gratitude. The storm outside howled, but inside there was peace. The snow room would hold them through whatever the winter would bring. As he turned back to the task at hand, Echo felt the weight of his ancestors' knowledge settle over him. He knew that the snow room was not just a physical shelter, it was a reflection of his people's relationship with the land. His ancestors had built these hidden rooms, tucked away from the world, to survive the worst storms. And now it was his turn to carry that knowledge forward. He reached for the last of the branches he had gathered earlier that morning, using them to reinforce the walls of the snow room. The branches were carefully woven into place, adding another layer of strength and protection. The stones, too, were placed with purpose, forming a barrier that would trap the heat and keep out the cold. Each piece was a part of the whole, each step a prayer for survival. Echo knew that this room, this sanctuary, was built not just with his hands, but with the spirit of his people. Ahuli moved to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. She too understood the importance of what they were creating. This was more than survival. It was a testament to the strength of their people, to the wisdom that had been passed down through the generations. The storm might rage outside, but inside they were safe. With the final stone in place and the last layer of fur added, Echo stood back and surveyed their work. The snow room was complete. The storm was no longer a threat. It was simply another part of the land they would endure together. The first gusts of wind struck with the force of a wild animal, tearing across the plains, shaking the trees and rattling the walls of the lodge. Echo could hear the howl of the wind, the snow already falling thick and fast outside. It was a blizzard unlike any he had felt before. The air itself seemed to freeze, and with each passing hour the storm only grew stronger. Yet inside the snow room, the fire still crackled, and the warmth held steady. Echo sat by the hearth, watching the flames dance, his thoughts turning inward. He had built this room with his hands, and now it would protect his family. The snow room was more than a shelter. It was a refuge for the spirit, a sacred space that connected them to the wisdom of their ancestors. Outside, the storm raged with fury, but inside there was peace, a peace that came from knowing they were prepared. Ahuli moved quietly beside him, placing another log on the fire. Their children had fallen asleep by the warmth of the flames, their faces peaceful, unaware of the storm's power. Echo felt a deep sense of gratitude for their safety, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The storm was fierce, and it would not relent. The winds would howl for days, and the snow would bury the plains deeper with every hour. Echo rose and walked to the fur-lined door of the snow room, gently pressing his hand against the cold surface. He could feel the storm's energy on the other side, could hear the wind pushing against the walls, trying to find a way in. But the snow room held strong. The layers of fur and earth, the branches and stones, had been placed with purpose. Every piece, every action had been a prayer for survival, and now, as the storm raged outside, that prayer was being answered. Echo stepped back from the door, turning to Ahuli. Their eyes met, and for a moment there were no words. She knew what he was thinking. They had built the snow room not just for this storm, but for every storm to come. This was their legacy, the legacy of their people. They had survived the cold before, and they would survive again. The winds outside howled louder, rattling the walls of the lodge, but inside, the warmth from the fire and the shelter remained constant. Echo knew that they would make it through. The storm was a test, but they had built their refuge with the wisdom of their ancestors, and that wisdom would guide them through the night. He settled back beside Ahuli, feeling the weight of his thoughts lighten. The storm would pass. They would endure, as they always had. The snow room was their protection, their strength. The storm had come, but it would not defeat them. Inside they were safe. The storm continued its violent assault as if nature itself had turned against them. The winds howled, screaming through the cracks in the lodge, pushing against the walls, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Echo listened to the fury outside, feeling the weight of the cold settle on the land. The snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, burying everything in its path. But inside the snow room, the warmth held strong. The fire still danced in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the fur-lined walls. Echo moved closer to the fire, watching as the flames crackled and sparked. The heat filled the small room, a small but powerful force that seemed to push back against the cold. Ahuli sat beside him, her eyes focused on the flames, her hands resting on her lap. The children slept soundly by the fire, their faces flushed with warmth. The storm outside was fierce, but in here they were safe. Echo reached into the pile of firewood beside him, selecting a thick log and placing it carefully into the flames. The wood hissed and popped as it caught fire, sending a fresh wave of heat into the room. He had carefully gathered the wood days before the storm arrived, knowing that it would be needed to fuel the fire during the harshest days of winter. His people had always relied on the power of fire to survive the cold, but it was more than just a source of warmth. It was a sacred element, a gift from the earth itself. As the fire burned, Echo reflected on the ancient knowledge his ancestors had passed down to him. They had learned how to live with the land, how to understand its rhythms and patterns. The storm that raged outside was a force of nature, but it was not invincible. It could be endured, weathered, and overcome. Echo knew that as long as the fire burned, as long as the snow room held its warmth, they would survive. Ahuli stood and moved to the doorway of the snow room, peering out into the storm. She could see nothing but white, the snow swirling in the wind like an endless tide. The world beyond their shelter was lost to the storm, a world of ice and darkness. But inside the snow room was a sanctuary, a place where life could continue despite the blizzard's fury. Echo joined her at the door, placing a hand on her shoulder. Together they watched the storm rage, knowing that their refuge would hold. The fire would burn, the warmth would stay, and the cold would not touch them. This was the dance of fire and ice, the eternal struggle between warmth and cold, between survival and death. And in this moment, the fire was winning. They returned to their place by the fire, Echo's heart filled with gratitude. The storm would test them, but they were ready. They had the wisdom of their ancestors, the warmth of the fire, and the protection of the snow room. The storm would pass, but the fire would remain, and they would endure. The storm raged on through the night and into the following day. The wind howled like a great beast, clawing at the snow room's fur-lined walls and rattling the logs of the main lodge. Echo sat by the fire, his thoughts consumed with the ever-deepening storm. He could feel the cold creeping closer, even within the sanctuary of the snow room, as the wind pushed against every crack and crevice. The snow outside was thick now, and the world beyond the lodge was hidden beneath a blanket of white. Inside, the fire burned bright, its glow dancing across the walls. But the air felt heavier, as though the storm had reached deep into the very bones of the earth. Echo could not shake the feeling that the storm was not merely a test of survival. It was a call. It was as if the land itself was sending a message, a warning. He looked out the small window, seeing nothing but swirling snow and gray skies. The storm was not just fierce, it was relentless, a force that would break all who did not respect its power. Ahuli moved beside him, her face pale from the cold, her eyes filled with the same unease that gripped Echo's heart. She had been quiet since the storm had begun, her strength tempered by the weight of the days. It was not like her to show fear, but the storm had brought with it a sense of something greater, something unknown. "Echo," she said softly, "how long will it last?" He did not answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. He knew the answer. He had seen winters like this before. They could last for days, sometimes weeks, until the land had given everything it could, and the storm had finally spent itself. But there was something different about this one. This storm was like a spirit, ancient, powerful, and unforgiving. "I don't know," Echo said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of his thoughts. "But we will endure, we always do." The words were true. His people had survived countless storms, and they had done so by trusting in the wisdom of their ancestors, by living in harmony with the land, and by preparing for the worst. The snow room, the fire, the protection of the earth, they were all part of that survival. Ahuli knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The spirits are with us," she said. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of generations. She knew what he knew, that survival was not just about physical strength, but about spiritual strength, and they had both. Echo nodded, but his thoughts were far from settled. He felt the storm's presence, felt it calling, as if challenging them to endure. It was a reminder of the power of the land, of the earth that gave and took in equal measure. The storm was fierce, but it would pass. And when it did, the land would remain. They would remain. As the days wore on, the storm outside showed no sign of letting up. The wind howled in its relentless fury, and the snow piled higher with each passing hour, burying the plains and trapping them within their lodge. Yet, inside the snow room, the warmth remained constant. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its light flickering against the walls lined with fur and hides, and Echo watched the glow with a quiet sense of pride. The storm, fierce and unyielding, was testing them, but they were not yielding. Echo had known that building the snow room was not just about shelter, it was about ensuring survival in a harsh world. His people had endured many storms, but none as fierce as this one. The wind, the cold, and the darkness outside were the forces they feared, yet they had nothing to fear now. The refuge they had built, layered with fur, stone, and earth, was holding strong. The cold that raged outside could not breach the sacred walls they had crafted. As Ahuli moved to check on their children, her hands gentle as she pulled the covers higher over their sleeping forms, Echo felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Their family was safe. The storm's power, which seemed so absolute outside, was but a fleeting moment in time. The snow room, though, would remain. It was a testament to the strength of his people and their ability to adapt, to build, and to endure. He sat back, his hands resting on his knees, watching the fire, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on the generations that had passed before him, on the ancestors whose wisdom had guided them to this point. Echo understood now, more than ever, the importance of remembering the old ways. The storm was not just a test of survival, it was a reminder that they were part of something greater than themselves. Their connection to the land, the spirits, and the earth was not just for times of peace. It was a lifeline during moments of darkness. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside it was as though time stood still. The snow room had become more than just a physical shelter. It had become a symbol of their strength, a beacon of hope in a world that could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful. The storm would pass, Echo knew. It always did. But what would remain was the quiet knowledge that they had endured it. They had built a refuge not just for the body, but for the spirit. The winds howled louder, rattling the walls, but the snow room held. Echo stood up, stepping closer to the fire. Ahuli joined him, and they stood together in silence, sharing the warmth, the peace, and the deep, unspoken understanding that they had built something sacred. Their ancestors would be proud. The storm could take the plains, but it could not take them. As the storm finally began to subside, the once violent winds softened into a distant, mournful howl. The snow continued to fall, but it was no longer the swirling, blinding blizzard it had been. Instead, it was a steady, quiet blanket, covering the land in white silence. Echo stood at the door of the snow room, looking out at the landscape beyond. The world was still. It was as though the storm had purged the plains, leaving behind an untouched, frozen wilderness. But he knew that beneath the snow, life would continue. The land was resilient, and so were they. Inside the snow room, the fire had burned low, the flames dancing in their final moments. The warmth was still there, though, as comforting as ever. Echo had felt the weight of the storm on his body, but now, as the air calmed, it was as if he could finally breathe again. The storm had tested them, just as he had known it would, but it had also taught him something deeper. It had reminded him of the importance of preparation, of listening to the land, and of honoring the old ways that had kept his people safe for generations. Ahuli was beside him, her face bathed in the soft glow of the fire. She had not spoken much during the storm, but Echo could feel her strength. She had been as calm as the fire itself, tending to their children, ensuring that they felt safe. Together they had weathered this storm. Together they had built something that had kept them safe when the world outside was threatening to swallow them whole. Their children were waking now, their eyes blinking in the soft light of the room. The youngest, a boy named Tewa, stretched and yawned, his small hands reaching for the warmth of the fire. His sister, a little older and more aware of the world around her, sat up with a quiet glance toward the door. She had felt the storm too, but the shelter had kept her safe. Echo smiled, his heart swelling with pride. They had survived, they had built their refuge, and now they could look outside at the world that had been transformed by the storm. But their work was not yet done. The storm had passed, yes, but there was still much to be done. The snow had buried their food stores, and the land would need to be reclaimed once more. Ahuli stood up, moving toward the fire to stoke it back to life. The warmth filled the room, and Echo could feel it seeping into his bones. The storm had come, and the storm had gone. But the land, this sacred, resilient land, had remained, and so would they. The winds had finally stopped, and the storm, after days of fury, began to lose its strength. The snow still fell gently, blanketing the earth in a peaceful quiet. But the worst of it had passed. Echo stepped outside the snow room, his eyes squinting against the brightness of the snow-covered plains. The world before him was serene, but he knew that the storm had left its mark, not just on the land, but on the hearts of those who had survived it. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the crisp, cold air, the scent of snow and earth filling his lungs. The storm had been a test, not just of his people's ability to endure, but of the strength of their connection to the land. And as he looked at the horizon, Echo realized that the storm had passed, but the lessons it carried would stay with them forever. Inside the snow room, the warmth of the fire still lingered, and Ahuli had already begun to prepare for the next phase. They had survived the storm, but now they had to rebuild, gather food, and tend to the land that had protected them. Echo knew that they would reclaim the earth, just as they always had. They would gather the fallen wood, dig through the snow for the food they had hidden, and restore what the storm had taken. The land had its challenges, but it also offered its bounty if they knew how to listen and how to work with it. Ahuli joined Echo at the door, her face still pale but filled with a quiet strength. Together they looked out at the plains, their hearts swelling with pride and gratitude. The storm had tested them, yes, but it had also shown them something deeper, something that had been there all along. It had shown them the power of the snow room, the power of their ancestors' wisdom, and the strength of their bond with the land. They had built more than just a shelter. They had built a legacy that would endure long after this storm, long after they were gone. Echo's grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. The land will always give you what you need if you know how to ask and how to give back. The storm had come, and the land had given them shelter. And now, as the sun began to set on the quiet plains, Echo knew that the land would continue to provide. It always had. It always would. Their survival was not just about building for the storm, but about living with the land, listening to it, and honoring it. That was the true legacy of his people. As Echo looked out at the still, silent world, he smiled. They had endured. They had survived. And in doing so, they had ensured that the legacy of the land would live on, passed down through the generations to come.